What's up guys, Asian here again with a PTS video, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Necromancer skill line. So we're going to be going through all three of the Necromancer skill lines, their morphs, and basically what I think of each skill, what kind of role it's going to be used for, and how it compares to current existing roles. This video might be a little bit long, but it will have a lot of information about the Necromancer skills as they are right now as of 5.0.0. Now, just like the rest of my PTS videos, please do keep in mind that this is only the first week of the PTS cycle, so things may change. DOS is aware that there are a couple of bugs with the skills and that the Necromancers right now are a little bit overtuned, so do expect some nerfs, some changes in the upcoming weeks. But let's go ahead and get into the actual skills. So there's three lines, just like the rest of the classes in the game: Gravelord, Bone Tyrant, and Living Death. Now, very similarly to the Warden, each of these lines kind of fall into each of the three different roles. So Gravelord is focused in on DPS skills, Bone Tyrant is focused in more on tanking skills, and Living Death is focused more on healing skills. Now, again, very similar to the Warden, that doesn't mean you can't use certain skills from certain lines in certain roles. So there are a couple of skills, for example, in Living Death that you might want to use on a DPS or a tank. So just kind of keep that in mind, that each of these three skill trees is really sort of focused in on one specific role. So the Gravelord, which is the DPS line, the ultimate is Frozen Colossus, and you have two morphs, Glacial Colossus and Pestilent Colossus. The Glacial Colossus is the Magicka morph, the Pestilent Colossus is the Stamina morph. So both of these applies major vulnerability to any enemy that is hit for 3 seconds. So each smash does it does 3 smashes. So it does it over 3 seconds, so if you go ahead and do the math, it should be about 5 seconds of major vulnerability uptime. Right now it is bugged where major vulnerability is only being applied on the first smash rather than all 3. So this is a pretty strong ultimate because of that major vulnerability. If you're going to be a Necromancer DPS, you will definitely be using this ability here as your primary ultimate. Now, on the tank healer side of things, comparing this to Warhorn, I already did the math a little bit, but that was back when the ultimate was a little bit cheaper. Now, with the increased cost in the ultimate, it does seem like this is going to be a little bit more comparable to Warhorn. It's still going to be a hair stronger overall, but when taking into consideration the fact that Warhorn also gives you max stats for 30 seconds, Warhorn and Colossus does end up being about equal, and I would probably say go with Warhorn because Warhorn is going to give you at the very least more consistent higher DPS compared to the Colossus, which is going to be more useful for burst DPS, so when you really need to burst something down. Plus, this also is an AoE application, so it might be better for trash bowls compared to something like Warhorn instead, if you really want to burn through trash bowls very, very quickly. The other 5 active abilities: Flame Skull. So this initially is a Magicka ability, and it morphs into either Venom Skull or Ricochet Skull. The Venom Skull is the Stamina morph. It just deals poison damage, and every third cast deals 20% increased damage. And when you have the Venom Skull morph, any Necromancer ability you cast will count towards this third cast. Ricochet Skull, the third cast will again deal 20% more damage, and it also bounce to other enemies, so it does have a little bit of additional cleave to it. As you can tell from the name, Flame Skull, it does deal flame damage on both Magicka, but it does poison damage on the Venom Skull. This is going to be one of your main spambles as a Necromancer. Not much to say here too much, just that it's basically your spambles, basically the same thing as birds for Warden. Blast Bones, so you have 2 morphs here. The initial ability is Magicka. Stalking Blast Bones is the Magicka morph, Blighted Blast Bones is the Stamina morph. So, Stalking Blast Bones, the skeleton deals more damage the longer it chases the target, so you're going to want to stand a little bit further away in order to make the most use out of Stalking Blast Bones. And Blighted Blast Bones just converts it into disease damage, so it initially does flame damage, now it does disease damage as Blighted Blast Bones, and it also applies Major Defile to basically anybody around them. So both of these abilities do leave corpses on death, and this corpse mechanic is a new one to Necromancers, and I'll go into that a little bit when we go over a skill, actually the next skill, which does kind of utilize these corpses. So this is going to operate pretty much exactly like the Warden's Shulk line, Shulk ability, where you want to use this ability, cast 2 abilities, and then use this ability again. So if you're very used to a Warden DPS rotation, then you will be pretty much set to go for Necromancer. The best rotations that I've come up with that have pulled the most DPS kind of focus in on using Blast Bones every 3rd cast. Then we have Boneyard. So this is a Magicka, so it does use Magicka. You can't really use this on Stamina. So you have two morphs, Unnerving Boneyard and Avid Boneyard. So Avid Boneyard, it consumes a corpse. So both of these morphs do consume a corpse on cast to do 20% more damage. And this is the sort of that corpse mechanic that I was talking about. If there is a corpse on the ground, certain Necromancer abilities will be able to consume that corpse for an additional effect. In this case, it just deals more damage. So the corpses you create, like Blast Bones, can only be used by yourself, and they will be used for any other Necromancer ability. You can also use things like ads and your teammates as well. As long as there are corpses on the ground, you're able to use them. So Avid Boneyard allows you to activate the synergy that it provides. And then Unnerving Boneyard does not allow you to use the synergy, but instead it applies Major Breach and Major Fracture to all enemies within the Boneyard itself. So this is going to be used obviously for magic DPS, but this could also be used as a tank, particularly the Avid Boneyard morph, because it does allow you to activate your own synergy. So you basically can just place it on top of yourself, and you'll be able to activate the synergy for Alkash or any other set that requires synergy use. So very, very powerful self-synergy move here with Avid Boneyard. Doesn't seem like it's going to be taking that sort of utility away, so this is going to be a very strong move for tanks to use. The other morph, Unnerving Boneyard, is also a very, very strong morph. You probably are going to potentially want to use this on a Magicka DPS instead for that AoE Breach and Fracture. Now, Shulk's initially, the Warden's ability did initially also have Major Breach and Fracture, which is a little bit unusual because they took that away from the Wardens. So I don't know why they decided to kind of keep that here, but this might be more useful on a Magicka DPS just because you do have that AoE Major Breach, Major Fracture, and tanks are going to want to use that self-synergy morph instead. You could also use it on a healer too. So those are kind of the two options there for Unnerving Boneyard. Then you have Skeletal Mage, so you have a Stamina morph and a Magicka morph again. The Stamina morph is Skeletal Archer, it turns the Mage into an Archer, and it deals physical damage. On each time it deals damage, the next attack does 10% more damage, and it leaves the corpse on death. Skeletal Arcanist is just basically a buff to the initial base morph, so it just deals magic damage to all enemies around the initial target, so basically just adds a little bit of an AoE component to this. So this is one of those sort of like lay and forget moves. So for obviously Stamina DPS or Magicka DPS, this is definitely going to be a move that you're going to want to keep on hand here. It does create a corpse on death that you can use for any sort of corpse ability as well. So pretty much cut and dry, not much to discuss here. Finally, we have Shocking Siphon. Again, base morph is Magicka, and it has a Stamina and Magicka morph here, so Zoss did a very good job at making sure that all the abilities here, at least under the DPS line, does have a Stamina morph. The Detonating Siphon, so you do need to have a corpse in order to use this ability, so whether that's an ad, the corpse you created yourself via a Necromancer move, or one of your allies, you do need to target the corpse itself. So it deals disease damage over 12 seconds, and if it lasts a full duration, then it'll explode, basically causing a little bit more AoE damage. And while it's slotted, you get a 3% additional damage done bonus. Mystic Siphon is the Magicka morph, pretty much the exact same thing, except it deals shock damage, and instead of exploding when you completely runs out, instead you restore Magicka over 12 seconds while you have that siphon active. So it is very useful for Magicka Necromancers to have the skill in order to get your resources up to a good amount here. And again, much like that Detonating Siphon, you also get that damage done bonus of 3% while it's slotted. So definitely a build that you're going to have slotted, especially for Magicka DPS because of that Magicka return. For Stamina DPS, a little bit less important to have this. I still am using this on my Stamina Necromancer rotations, and I found it to be very useful. But even if you are not going to end up using it, you still want to slot it for that 3% additional damage done bonus. Now for the passives, we have reusable parts, so whenever an enemy dies within 4 seconds of being damaged by one of your Necromancer abilities, your next summon basically ability is free. Death Knell, this is definitely going to be changed. This is definitely overperforming. So it increases the critical strike chance against enemies under 25% health by 10% for each Gravelord ability slotted. So for example, on my front bar right now, I have 4 abilities. So I would have 40% additional crit chance under 25% health. So this is a very, very strong ability right now, and I highly anticipate this being changed in a future PTS patch. Dismember, while the Gravelord ability is active, you basically get additional penetration. So, you know, if you have Skeletal Archer or Skeletal Arcanist, this does count, so you have 16 seconds of additional penetration. Then Rapid Rot, this just increases your damage over time abilities, your damage by 10%. Pretty cut and dry. Now the Bone Tyrant line, this is all focused in on tanking. So again, you could use this for other roles, but it's primarily focused around tanking. So the ultimate ability is Bone Goliath. So basically it transforms you into this Goliath and increases your max health for 30,000 for 20 seconds, and it also immediately restores 30,000 health. It lasts for 20 seconds, and while you're transformed, your light and heavy attacks do restore health, and the ability does scale off your max health, so this is not a good ability to use if you are a DPS, obviously. This is going to be a tank ultimate. So you have two morphs, Ravenous and Pummeling Goliath. Ravenous, you just get an aura that drains nearby enemies of their health, and then Pummeling Goliath, your bash attacks are an AoE ability. So compared to the next best ability to compare this to would be Magma Shell on a Dragon Knight. This is going to be a little bit weaker because it doesn't provide any additional sort of damage mitigation. It just increases your max health versus Magma Shell, which basically caps all incoming damage to 3% of your max health. Not quite as strong as Magma Shell, but still a pretty useful ultimate. For a Necromancer tank, I'm probably not going to end up using this morph. There are more powerful ultimates to use than a Bone Goliath on a tank. You have Death Scythe, so you have a Stamina morph and a Magicka morph here. So this is basically your self-heal. It does a little bit of damage, but it also heals you. So when you do that damage, and then it also heals you, and it also provides an additional heal over time. If you have Hungry Scythe morph, the Ruinous Scythe morph will inflict what's called healing absorption. So basically it just negates a certain amount of healing, in this case 2,000. So this stamina morph obviously is going to be more useful for PvP. And then for both morphs, if you have additional enemies that are hit by the scythe itself, because it is a cone, you will get some additional healing done. So this is basically the tank's self-heal. I've used it to pretty good success in Sunspire, so this is definitely an ability you're going to want to have as a tank. Obviously you're going to go with the Magicka morph rather than the stamina morph here. And you have Bone Armor. You have two morphs here. You have Summoner's Armor and Beckoning Armor. So this is your major ward, major resolve, and the base lasts for 20 seconds. Summoner's Armor, while you have it active, you reduces the cost of your Necromancer summons, so that's Blast Bone, Skeletal Mage, and Spiritnder by 12%. And then Beckoning Armor, whenever it's active, enemies that strike you with a range attack will be pulled towards you once every 3 seconds, and both of these morphs create a corpse when the effect completes. So there's basically both of these morphs are pretty strong overall. Summoner's Armor does give you a little bit more sustain, and I have found it to be very useful on a Stamina Necromancer, where sustain is going to be a little bit more challenging compared to a Magicka Necromancer, but you can still use this on a Magicka Necromancer as well. This is obviously going to be useful on a tank for your major ward, major resolve. You're going to want to be using Beckoning Armor for the chain pull, but the cost reduction is still very useful on a tank. And then for a healer, again, you'll probably want to use the Summoner's Armor for some additional sustain that way, because you will be using Spiritnder. Then you have Bitter Harvest, and you have two morphs, Deaden Pain and Necrotic Potency. So basically, you need corpses in order to use this move. So basically, grants you ultimate and heals you for every corpse that you consume. So this doesn't cost anything, but you do need to have corpses around you. It's a 12-meter radius. Necrotic Potency grants you 6 ultimate compared to 2 ultimate, and it heals you for a certain amount of health every second for 2 seconds per additional corpse that you manage to consume, and it does scale off your max health. And while it's slotted, you do get some damage reduction of 3%. Deaden Pain, on the other hand, grants you only 2 ultimate, same amount of healing per corpse consumed, and while you have that heal effect active, you gain major protection, reducing the damage you take by 30%, and again, it scales off your max health, and you get that damage reduction while it's slotted. So this is a really strong move for tanks. You just want to pair this with abilities, Necromancer abilities that leave corpses, and then you can use this, you get to heal, and you get ultimate. So this is a really strong move for tanks in order to get your ultimate generation really, really high, and that way you can just pump out more warhordes. So really, really strong move here for tanks. Then you have Bone Totem. You have two morphs here, Agony Totem and Remote Totem. So the base ability just gives you minor protection to anybody within the radius. It's a 6-meter radius, so a little bit larger than Circle of Protection, and it uses Magicka, so it's obviously going to be a lot more useful, a lot more easier to use than Circle of Protection. A little bit cheaper as well. And then after 2 seconds, the totem itself instills fear on enemies, holding them in place for 4 seconds, so this could be used as a hard CC move for Necromancer tanks here. Agony Totem provides a synergy, and it is placed right on top of you, so you basically need to activate it within the stack basically, and it deals certain amount of damage over 5 seconds and applies minor vulnerability for that same duration, so 5 seconds. The remote totem just allows you to place it within 28 meters of you. So again, this is mostly going to be used for tanks. You could potentially use remote totem on a healer in order to kind of provide minor protection to the group now. So now you don't need to use circular protection and waste stamina. You can just use remote totem on a necromancer healer to get that minor protection. The agony totem morph is going to be end up being more useful for tanks itself. The synergy is probably not going to be used all too much because it does require you to be within the stack, the DPS stack. So for stack and burn fights, potentially you can use Agony Totem. I'm thinking like for L'Oreal, Rocco 2 perhaps. But for other fights, this is going to be more selfish. This is going to be more for minor protection on yourself, as well as that hard CC. Then you have Grave Grasp. So you have two morphs, Ghostly Embrace and Empowering Embrace. So the base morph basically summons 3 patches of Skeletal Claws in front of you, and it basically provides a snare, a 50% snare for 5 seconds, and minor maim for 5 seconds. The Empowering Grasp morph, if you hit you or your allies within that, you grant them Empower for 5 seconds. And if you hit your Skeletal Mage or Spirit Mender, it enhances them for 5 seconds, increasing their effectiveness by 40%. And you have Ghostly Embrace, which basically allows each patch to mobilize 1 enemy for 4 seconds. So overall, I don't really see this morph being used all too much. This is nice for the snare as well as the AoE minor maim, but there are better ways to get minor maim. If you're just fighting against the boss, for example, Heroic Slash, perfectly fine. If you need the AoE minor maim, Thurbican is going to be a better source, I think. It's going to be at the very least more consistent and resource free. The Empower for your Skeletal Mage, Spirit Mender, and your allies is not all that important, and the Mobilization morph, you can just use the Bone Totem instead. There is a 2-second, you kind of have to time it because it's 2 seconds for the fear, but it's going to be a little bit more consistent than a Grave Grasp. So if you go ahead and take a look at Grave Grasp itself, you can see that's basically what it looks like. But I'd rather use the totem itself for the immobilization rather than the grasp. Then the passives, so we have Death Gleaning, so with the Bone Tyrant ability slotted, whenever an enemy you are in combat with dies within 28 meters of you, you restore 100 magic and stamina, so this is a little bit of sustain for tanks here. Sustained Harm, it reduces the damage you take from damage over time abilities by 10% while you have a Bone Tyrant ability active, so it needs to be active. It's not a flat reduction, you need to have something like a Summoner's Armor active to get the reduction. Health Avarice, increases the healing received by 2% for each Bone Tyrant ability slotted, pretty cut and dry. Then the Last Grasp, just a 2000 addition to max health, which actually makes Necromancer DPS a little bit interesting, because now you can use different food perhaps, or even different races, because now you don't need to worry about their health anymore, because you have that 2000 additional max health from Last Gasp. So pretty interesting passive. It's very, very basic, but it does open up a little bit of flexibility when it comes to builds. Now finally, we're going over the Living Death line. This is, again, the healer line, but can use these abilities on other roles, obviously, depending on, the specifics, what you want out of your specific character. The Reanimate, which is the Resurrection Ultimate, so it basically brings back up to 3 allies at a target location. It's a very large radius, 12 meters. I anticipate this potentially being nerfed down to like 8 meters or even half to 6 meters, and you can place it away from you, so you don't have to be centered around you. So really, really strong. From what I could tell, it kind of picks the 3 allies randomly. If there's more than 3 allies within the resurrection area, there might be some pattern, like perhaps people closer to the center are prioritized first, but from what I can tell, it seems to be pretty random. Renewing Animation just restores magic and stamina for each ally you resurrect to yourself, so really useful on a tank, especially for progression guilds. Hey, you have 3 people down, you pop this, you get 1500 stamina and 15,000 magic and stamina back, and you have 3 allies up. Really, really strong. The resources that you get is basically the exact same thing as if you had to manually res them. So they get half health and I think 20 or 25% magic and stamina. The other morph also allows you to consume 2 other corpses in the targeted area, and summons blast bones for each corpse consumed. And because you obviously have 3 corpses, because you have 3 allies that are dead, you will always get those blast bones whenever you use this ability. So pretty interesting ultimate to have. If you were to choose between the 2 of them, you'd want to use Renewing Animation as a tank, and you'd want to use Animate Blast Bones potentially as a DPS or a healer. You could also use Animate Blast Bones as a tank in order to create more corpses, because those blast bones will also leave corpses for you to use. And if you go ahead and take a look back at the Bone Tyrant line, then you can use Necrotic Potency, so you gain 16 ultimate or 18 ultimate immediately after you resurrect 3 people. Really, really solid there. Render Flesh, this is an interesting move here. So you basically apply Minor Defile to yourself, but you heal you or an ally in front of you for a certain amount of health. So pretty interesting. You have two morphs here, Resistant Flesh and Blood Sacrifice. Blood Sacrifice allows you to consume a corpse to heal a second target, and Resistant Flesh allows you to grant resistances to the target equal to half of the amount healed for 3 seconds. This basically gives them a little bit of additional survivability here. Now, this is pretty interesting on a healer just because you're applying Minor Defile to yourself, which reduces the healing that you do to yourself, as well as your health recovery. But Leofa actually raised an interesting point for the kind of use this on a tank, because Minor Defile can be cleansed, so you can use this, and then you can use a Templars Purify synergy in order to get Alkoch, because now you have a debuff, which means you can use the Purify synergy. So pretty interesting use case for Render Flesh on a tank, and for healers, this is pretty much very similar to the Nightblade's burst heal. I'm blanking on it. Healthy Offering, where there's a little bit of a downside to using it. So just bear that in mind if you want to use this on a healer. Then you have Expunge, so this does have a health cost. So embrace the power of death, and it removes up to 2 negative effects from you. So this is basically a self-cleanse here. While it's slotted, you have a cost reduction to all of your abilities by 3%. Expunge and Modify restores magic and stamina for each negative effect you remove, so up to about 1030. And then Hexproof just allows you to remove up to 4 negative effects instead. So this is actually pretty nice. It does have a health cost associated with it, so just keep that in mind here. Definitely want to use this on a tank for your own sort of self-purge here, and just use as health. And it's actually pretty cheap. It's only 1940 health here, plus you get some additional resources back whenever you remove a negative effect. So you could potentially do this combination here. So you could do Render Flesh with Expunge and Modify as a tank, but obviously this is you're losing, and you end up losing more magicka, losing more resources than you gain. You can use that, apply Minor Defile, then you can expunge it from yourself like that. But I wouldn't recommend doing that because it's you're using up more resources than you're gaining back that way. You have Life in Mid-Death, so you release so basically it's an AoE heal, so just pretty much like Budding Seeds on a Warden. And it also consumes a corpse on cast if there's a corpse to continue the heal for a certain amount of health over 5 seconds, so just adds additional heal over time. You don't need to have a corpse here, so if you don't have the corpse, you just won't have that hot component associated with it. 2 morphs, Enduring Undeath and Renewing Undeath. Enduring Undeath, you can consume multiple corpses to extend the duration for 5 seconds for each corpse. Then you have Renewing Undeath, where consuming a corpse also provides a purge for up to 3 negative effects. So if you're a Necromancer healer, this is going to be a pretty useful skill to have slotted here. You're going to basically use it just like Budding Seeds on a Warden healer. Then you have Spiritnder, so basically it just summons a ghostly spirit that stays by your side for 16 seconds, and it heals you or the lowest health ally around you based on percentage every 2 seconds for a certain amount. Then you have 2 morphs, Spirit Guardian and Intensive Mender. So Spirit Guardian, while it's active, 10% of the damage you take is transferred to the spirit instead. Intensive Mender, it heals for 3 times as much but lasts half as long. So Leofa did make a case for running Intensive Mender rather than Spirit Mender on a tank. So naturally, my inclination would be to use Spirit Mender for the additional damage reduction, but there is an argument for Intensive Mender instead, because you can recast it after 4 seconds expires to create a corpse. So this does create a corpse, and then you can combine that with the Bone Tyrant move, Necrotic Potency, to get 6 ultimate every 4 seconds using Intensive Mender here. Me personally, I'm probably going to stick with Spirit Mender for the damage reduction, but Intensive Mender is also a pretty solid choice too. This is definitely something you're going to want to use as a Necromancer healer as well as just additional passive heals. Obviously, you can choose which one you want. If you want a little bit more survivability, go with Spirit Mender, but obviously Intensive Mender is going to give you a little bit more heals for over shorter duration, but it also provides a corpse. And much like the argument Leofa used, you'll have more corpses, so you're able to use those abilities that consumes corpses for additional effects more easily this way. Finally, you have Restoring Tether. This does require you to have a corpse in order to use it. So you siphon the remnants of life from a corpse, healing for a certain amount of health over 12 seconds to yourself and all allies between you and the corpse. So this is a pretty interesting mechanic, so now you kind of have to line things up. So if you have a corpse on the boss, you want to make sure you're basically forming a line with yourself. Then you have your allies, the stack, and then you have the corpse over here. Just want to make sure that that line, that beam, is actually hitting that corpse and the allies at the same time. So a pretty interesting ability here. You have 2 morphs, Braided Tether and Mortal Coil. Mortal Coil restores stamina while you're cycling the corpse. So this, I actually found this to be potentially useful on a stamina necromancer, again because that's a sustain issue, but you get some additional healing done as well. And then Braided Tether, it also heals allies in a radius around you as well. So if you're in the stack, now you're able to heal people around you, or if they're behind you perhaps, then you also get the additional heal that way. And then while this ability is slotted, you also get 3% additional healing done. So even if you don't intend on using this skill as a Necromancer healer, you still want to have it slotted for the additional healing done bonus. You could also use Mortal Coil on a tank. So what I was doing Necromancer tank, I was combining a Spirit Guardian with Mortal Coil, or the armor with Mortal Coil, so that way I have some additional stamina sustain while I'm tanking something, for example. And finally, the passive abilities. Curative Curse, while you have negative effect on you, your healing done is increased by 8%, so you can actually combine this with Render Flesh here to increase the healing done. So while your healing received is reduced, you can still output stronger heals that way. Near Death Experience, while you have a Living Death ability slotted, your critical strike chance with all healing abilities is increased up to 20% in proportion to the severity of the target's wounds. This basically gives you a little bit more chance to critically heal somebody who's lower on health. Corpse Consumption, when using the ability on a corpse you generate 10 ultimate. This effect can occur once every 16 seconds. So this is the ulti generation passive for Necromancers. It's a little bit stronger than things like the Dragon Knight, Templar, Warden passives, but it is a little bit more difficult to kind of activate because it's not like you just use an ability. You have to actually consume a corpse in order to get the ultimate generation. And finally, Undead Confederate, while you have Necromancer Summon active, your magic and stamina regen is increased by 300. Really strong passive here. You do want to pick up this passive for all 3 roles for that sustain passive. So the DPS, you get some additional sustain. Tanks, you get the additional magicka regen. Healers, you get that magicka regen. So you definitely want to pick this up. So you definitely want to level on Living Death to 50 no matter what role you have, just for this Undead Confederate passive here. So that is going to be it for this video. So again, this is only the first week of the PTS, so these abilities are going to be retuned throughout the duration of the PTS. ZOS is already aware, the devs are aware that some of these abilities are overperforming, and there are a couple of bugs with some of these abilities. For example, Blast Bones may kill your friends if it explodes in an inopportune time. Hopefully you guys found this video informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.